Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream in a six-part series called Colorism in the Workplace. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Webb, and I am joined by a very special guest today, Olliette, and I'll have her introduce herself in just a second. But a few housekeeping things before we dive into this conversation. This week's topic is focusing on company culture, thinking about how colorism shows up in company culture and how it negatively impacts company culture. And then we'll also consider some ways or approaches that people might take to help address the problem. And we will be taking time for audience questions or comments. So definitely leave your feedback or your questions or your thoughts in the chat if you have them. I like interactive live streams. So if you're tuning in, be sure to just say hello. If you hear something that resonates with you or you hear something that changes your perspective, be sure to drop emojis or, just positive feedback in the comments as well. And we will begin in just a few minutes. Also, consider that I have two more live streams left in this series. This is number 4. So I'll be back next Thursday with a conversation on interventions and preventions in the workplace. And then the last week we'll wrap up on March 17th with another special guest, one of my fellow LinkedIn Creator Accelerator program members. So as we get ready to start, let's look and see who we have joining us today. I'm so excited for Olliette. Olliette is someone that I've known for a little bit, has participated in a contest. She's consulted with me and I've consulted with her on various aspects of the work that we do. And she's very dynamic and I always enjoy talking to her. She's insightful and on point and keeps it real, which we like around these parts. So Olliette, go ahead and tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and what you do.
Well, I'm Olliette Murry-Drobot. My background is really in social justice work. I've spent about 20 years in the nonprofit arena, about the last 15 years in leadership roles. And most of my work has been really with working within and with marginalized communities. And so working with folks, who are at the intersections of, anti-Blackness, racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, colorism, and you can go on and on. And so, yeah, that's what my work has been, really focused on strategies to disrupt oppressive systems. And so for about the last year, opened up a small consulting firm called O2 Strategic Partners. And so I'm working with companies and organizations around, strategy and management and operations, and also just helping them to create healthier environments.
Yes, those healthier environments. That's why we're talking today. So just really quickly for the audience, because I'm not sure who's going to be watching the live stream or who's going to be watching the recording. We are talking about colorism in the workplace, and colorism is defined as a system of social stratification that privileges people with lighter skin tones and marginalizes or discriminates against people with darker skin tones. That's a very basic definition. I encourage you to go back and watch the first live stream for a fuller discussion on defining colorism, but just so everyone's up to speed with that particular definition. And we do have a couple of people saying hello in the chat. Hi, Aaron White and Lauren Liu. Thank you all for joining us today. Let us know if you have any questions or thoughts in the comments. We'll be taking questions as we go. But Olliette, can you talk to us a little bit about what is company culture, right? I think we hear that phrase, but what does it actually mean?
Yeah, I would say we hear that phrase a lot. It's not really clear what it is. I think about company culture as the way people behave, how they interact with each other. It's the values that folks talk about. So yeah, it's really how folks relate to each other, right? And most companies, whether they think they do or not, have core values, right? And again, it's the things that are important to that company, and things where the behavior follows those values as well. Because a lot of
Mhm.
times folks have values just on paper, and when you ask a staff person, they're like, "Let me find my piece of paper so I can read off the values." Right? But it really is how folks treat each other and what's important to them.
Absolutely. I love that so much that it's the combination of the values that you espouse, that you proclaim to have,
Yeah,
and the actions that follow up, right? Do you also walk the walk? And so if a
yeah.
company says they value relationship building, do they actually create an environment where that's possible, right? So I really like that definition, and just the way people interact with each other is, I think, is a very layperson's way of doing that. um, and so then let's get right to the main question: is how do you think colorism could impact company culture, and why should leaders care about colorism as potentially impacting their company culture?
Well, it really comes down to whether or not folks feel like it's a fair and equitable environment, right? Does everyone get treated fairly, right? And staff members often will pick up on things right away in terms of if there's preferential treatment, right? Who's getting promotions, who's getting opportunities to lead visible, projects, right? And who's in leadership roles. So and I really think about culture in ways how it shows up in terms of if if companies are able to keep good employees, all those good
Mhm.
employees, saying, to their friends and colleagues, come and work here, right? It's also, minimizing politics and confusion. It's also whether or not there's trust among folks, right? And if there's transparency. So all of those things build into culture. And again, if folks perceive that there's not fairness, right? If folks are not treated equitable, right? Some people are valued more than others. That shows up even in the practice of colorism, right?
Mhm. Yeah, when you mentioned companies being able to retain good employees, that resonated with me. I recently left my job, right? And I think company culture had something to do with that, and not feeling like the workplace was as inclusive and as diverse as it needed to be, right?
Mhm.
Despite the values that were stated on paper, my former employer did not put into action those values, right? And it was evident that in order for me to feel um, like I could pursue the work that I really wanted to do, that it would be better to leave. And I would not have recommended, right? And even the part about not only am I happy there, but is it a place I would recommend for others? And not
Mhm.
even just recommending it to my friends, but like if there were a green book for employers, would your employer make the list? Would you tell other POCs
Right,
to work at this company? Would you tell other women to work at this company? Would you tell other LGBTQIA plus folks to work at this company? Or
right.
would you warn them to stay away? And so I think that is really important in terms of recruitment and retention. And then, like you said, once people are on the job, do they feel like things are fair? Because I think morale can really negatively impact
Yeah.
company performance.
Do they feel like the leaders care, right? Do,
Mhm.
do they care? I think people are going to show up and lean in and give their best to organizations where they feel like the leadership cares about them.
Yes, absolutely. So really quickly, um, this is kind of backtracking just a little bit. I'm curious to know, for you, when did you start to be aware of colorism, right? And so kind of zooming out a little bit, like not just in the workplace, but for you, why does colorism matter to you just on a society level?
So I grew up, and I still live in a city which is predominantly Black. And so I feel like I probably have more incidents around colorism than even racism. And
Mm,
so I realized from a very early age, just with family, that, certain skin colors were more valued than others, and just, messages, right? And that there was such a thing as being too Black, right?
mhm,
And the jokes and the slurs. And so, Yeah, from a very early age, I was very aware of the color of my skin. Also remember, in elementary school, right, you would have plays and, dances, and who would get chosen, to
Mhm.
be in the plays in the leads, right? And I picked up on that right away. And also just, popular culture and the media, right? I didn't see a lot of folks who looked like me, right?
Mhm.
Many of the young women, would be, lighter skinned. In fact, a lot of them were biracial, maybe having one white parent. And so I saw a lot of that. And so, yeah, I remember doing a project when I was in college, undergraduate, and I was looking at this issue, whether or not race or class impacted folks the most. One thing I
Mm.
didn't realize for the students I was talking to, we had a long history of, higher education. I remember talking to one young man, his grandfather was a heart surgeon. I could not imagine that.
Wow.
I could not, his father had been a heart surgeon. He was very light skinned. It was like the one drop rule, right? So I
Mhm.
noticed that among those who had upper class, middle class background through generations, they were
Mhm.
typically lighter skinned with
Mhm.
straighter hair.
Yes. That is, yeah, that's very profound. That's also something that I take note of too, is the correlation or the relationship between class and color. And I found that a lot of times when you do hear of people who are like third generation um graduate school PhDs, right? Like their
Mhm.
grandparents were professors and their grandparents
Yeah.
were school teachers or lawyers or pharmacists, right? That is definitely part of the American legacy where people who were of mixed race ancestry, African Americans who are of mixed race ancestry, were the first to be afforded educational opportunities. They were the first to be afforded career and professional opportunities, right, amongst the
Mhm.
African American population. And that kind of speaks to the workplace dynamic as well, right? In terms
Mhm.
of who is even in the workplace and that sort of
Right.
pipeline, who's allowed to progress or who's encouraged or is supported in their career trajectories because of the generational past, but also
Mhm.
just the biases once they are in the workplace for themselves. And so, talking about colorism in the workplace, do you have thoughts on what that might actually look like? So, if someone were curious as to whether or not how to identify an instance of colorism in the workplace, do you have any examples you could offer?
Yeah, I would say it looks like, when you're in a leadership room, when I'm in rooms, right? Am I the only particularly dark skinned woman who's in the
Mhm.
space, right? I recall serving on a panel, and although this panel had a number of women of color, I was the only dark skinned woman on the panel. It was all women, and I was the only one. And yeah, and like I said, I think I've heard in some of the other conversations, yeah, it looks like what does the leadership look like?
Mhm.
It also, sounds like slurs and jokes at the expense of darker skinned people, right?
Mhm.
And so then, and again, I remember having a conversation with a white colleague, and I don't think she meant any harm, but she just mentioned like how attractive she perceives biracial people to be.
Mm.
And we know that there's a thing in terms of women, in terms of their success, in terms of the more attractive you perceive to
Yep.
be, the more likely you're more successful you are, most likely going to be. So again,
Mhm.
I don't think she meant any harm. She was just making an observation, but that just stuck with me.
Yeah. And that sounds like when the need to have the conversation around implicit bias because, like you're saying, she probably would never consciously or intentionally say, I'm going to favor
Hmm.
biracial people over people who are not biracial. But if that's her belief is that they are just more aesthetically pleasing,
Yeah.
then she has to be willing to interrogate the way that impacts her perceptions of them in other ways, right? Their performance reviews, when they're on
Mhm.
job interviews, when
Right.
they're being brought up for raises or promotions and that sort of thing. Um,
Right.
a lot of these implicit biases are, running rampant for amongst people of all races. And so I'm glad you also noted that that was a white colleague, because a lot of times people think colorism can only happen between people of the same race. But I think
Mhm.
when we talk about the workplace, it's important to know that even our white coworkers and our white managers, our white executives also have biases that prefer people with lighter skin tones and straighter hair textures, right?
Right, right. I can tell
Um,
you, even in spaces now where the focus of the conversation is racial equity, a lot of times the individuals that are leading those conversations are typically lighter skin or even biracial oftentimes. So again, it can show up in a lot of ways in terms of, because sometimes folks are going by who has the higher, education, right? And I have noticed sometimes, especially in academia, if you look at, who has the PhDs, right? A lot of times, if you're looking at Black folks, they oftentimes have lighter skin. So if you're just going by that, and those are the folks who are going to lead and facilitate the conversations and serve on the panel, then you'll often see there's a lack of color, a lack of diversity of colors
mhm.
in those cases.
Absolutely. And on my Instagram, a recent Instagram post, a lighter skinned person, had a transparent moment in the comments. They shared with us that they do see colorism in DEI spaces, diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces, when people are talking about racial justice. She said this person, I don't know how they identify, but they noted that white people gravitate towards lighter skinned people of color in those spaces, and that even within herself or themselves, they also gravitated towards lighter skinned people, just unconsciously or subconsciously. And so they were talking in the comments about having to unlearn that even within themselves. And
Mhm.
having, I also spoke about doing presentations with my lighter skinned sister, even on colorism. And it's interesting how, even when we're talking about colorism, a lot of times people prefer to hear it from lighter skinned folks, right? And
Right, right.
they give the benefit of the doubt, or the lighter skinned person is perceived as more rational, more logical, coming at it from a more
More
academic lens.
objective.
They've
Yeah,
studied it more, they researched it more. Whereas if someone who looks like you or I is talking about colorism, the assumption is often, oh, well, you're just talking about it from an emotional
right.
perspective, or you're just kind of, venting about your personal experiences, or even more harsher criticisms, you're jealous or you're bitter or that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
I will say, when you mention that harsher criticism, it also can show up in generalizations and stereotypes. So the angry Black woman, right? Typically, when somebody's thinking about angry Black woman, they're probably thinking about someone who looks like me versus someone who's lighter skinned. Or, if somebody deems someone being aggressive, right? Oftentimes they're talking about a darker skinned person. So again, those negative perceptions they're already coming with, that again is going to blur the way that they see you.
Yes, absolutely. And Aaron White has an important comment that darker skinned people are often seen as more likely to be violent, right? And so, going back to
Mhm.
the angry Black woman stereotype, I definitely think some of the biases and the stereotypes that are working out here are, yes, you're more likely to be angry, but you're also more likely to, like, steal from the company, right? Or if cash comes up missing in
Yeah.
the register, like, who are we most likely to blame for it? Who's most likely to be profiled? And
Hmm.
even thinking about the way companies interact with clientele, the way they interact with customers or potential customers, and creating a company culture where not only is colorism not tolerated amongst the workforce, but it's also not tolerated in how they engage with their clients and customers, because
Yes.
that's a whole side of it.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Yes. And I think with, for anyone listening, what we are talking about is in the context of colorism as a social issue. And we're focusing in on colorism in the workplace, but the workplace is just a microcosm of the larger society. So what's happening in the larger society is going to manifest or show up in the workplace in some way. And I think there are a lot of possible ways to approach solving this problem, Aliette. And I'd like you to share, one or two general approaches that a company can take if they just want to start either learning more or actually start implementing a practice or a strategy to start to address an issue like colorism in the workplace.
Well, one, and I've been to DEI workshops and trainings. It's rare that you hear colorism talked about. So, one, including it in the conversation when you're talking about DEI, right? Including it in the conversation. And when you're talking about unconscious bias, again, including colorism into that conversation. I think companies also just paying attention to their hiring, their process, retention, uh, who
Mhm.
gets promotions, looking at the gap between salaries. There's a lot of research out there that shows that there is a gap in terms of income and salaries in terms of lighter skinned people and darker skinned folks.
Mhm.
And I think companies have to be aware of that, right? And I think you've mentioned this a lot of times. Folks will sometimes think of that as racism and miss that it's colorism that's
Yeah.
happening.
Mhm. Absolutely. That reminds me, because I've wanted to do a post, and I might still do it, even though the news story has kind of died down a little bit. But the professor I think it was Columbia University, who tweeted about a very dark-skinned model,
Yeah.
referring to her as, being a beautiful sight to see, but a freak of nature. And a
Mhm.
lot of people in the discourse around that were saying, "Oh, it was racist. It was so racist of him to say that," right? And one, racism is related to it. It's tied to racism, but I think people have to have the courage to acknowledge that he would not have made that comment about a lighter skinned Black person.
Right.
He would
Right.
not have called Beyonce a freak of nature. He would not have called even someone like a Queen Latifah, right, who's sort of a
Right.
medium brown person, the average brown person. I don't even think he would have referred to me as a freak of nature, right? Because this particular model's skin was much darker than what we're
Right.
used to seeing, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so if people are responding to situations like that only through the lens of racism, they're really missing the core of the problem, because he
Right.
wasn't thinking about her race when he made that comment. He was looking at her skin tone when he made that comment. And, I'm glad that the university reacted, but whether it's a university or some other type of company or place of work, then in order to really address instances like that in the future, you have to also talk about colorism, like you're saying. um all right. So let's see. I don't think we have any questions from the audience. Now would be a great time if you have questions, whether they're related to colorism more broadly or focusing specifically on company culture or colorism in the workplace. We are happy to respond. Or if you have other thoughts or comments to add as well. Um, I want Aliette to kind of leave us before we go with any big ideas or final points that you would like to emphasize about colorism broadly or about colorism in the workplace and company culture specifically? Anything that maybe I didn't ask directly, but that you really want the audience to hear and understand?
I saw something fascinating recently, and I can't remember the company. And I saw on their application they asked about the color of the person's skin, and they had
Mm.
different shades on there. And I was like, "Oh my goodness!" There were some folks like, What in the world is this?" But it was a progressive organization, and what I felt like they were trying to get at is making sure there's even diversity among people of color, because again, even when folks say, the minorities, we have a higher count of minorities in corporate America. If you really look at it, it's really skewed towards lighter, right? It's
Mhm.
so paying attention to that. I think companies paying attention to that. Is there really diversity within the people of color that you're hiring?
Mm.
Just that level of awareness would start to really start the conversation.
I like that, and I know some people are probably like, "Oh, well, it's enough diversity for us just to have any people of color."
Right, right, right,
And now
right.
you want us to have diverse people of color? But I think that's such a great way to put it and such a simple way to put it, and it's making me think too, if you don't mind me throwing another question out there. When we started this conversation, you mentioned that company culture has a lot to do with values and the kinds of values that we state or proclaim, but more
Mhm.
importantly, the kinds of values that we live out, that we put into action as a
Right.
company, as leaders in a company, as team members in a company. Do you have ideas about what kinds of values would help prevent colorism from happening in company culture, or that would help a company culture be more inclusive and equitable for diverse people of color?
Yeah, you know what? And you just mentioned it. A lot of companies will have equity as a value, fairness, transparency, that they value inclusion and diversity, right?
Mhm,
And again, those are nice to have on paper, but if you really look at the behavior, right? If you really look at the
mhm,
behavior of the folks, of the leaders, how folks are interacting with each other, if you really look at how that's supported through policies and procedures, then you
mhm.
really start to see where you have some breakdowns and where you can do better as a
Yes.
company.
Yeah, policies and procedures. I think that's so important, and not just having the values, but tying each of those values to a specific policy, right? And it's kind of like in education, we call it backwards planning, right? You have
Mhm,
the
mhm,
objective, like what's the actual activity that we're going to do to meet that goal. So I really
right.
like that. We do have a couple of questions that came in. Thank you. Aaron has been very active in the chat, so we appreciate you for being here. How do we make sure these things are brought up and kept alive in the conversations in the workplace, social spaces, etc.? I am working with Black women specifically and trying to heal scars from these institutions or these situations. So do you have thoughts about that? I'll throw it to you first.
Well, I will tell you, sometimes I feel like the lone voice in conversations sometimes, but I have made sure I bring up the issue of colorism. If I'm especially if I'm in a space talking about racial equity, I
Mhm.
bring up the issue of colorism. Now, folks may look at me like I grew another head, and sometimes they do, right? But if I don't bring it up, I don't know who else might bring it up, right? And I
Mhm.
want folks to start to really think about that. And
Yeah.
so, again, sometimes you have to be the person who brings it up. That's not to say folks are going to welcome the conversation. And sometimes, I didn't know, Dr. Webb, you talked about this. Sometimes folks are going to accuse you of being divisive. That there's no unity, right? Why are you bringing this up? But again, if you're trying to silence me, there is no unity anyway. So again, that's something that's painting me, that something has impacted my life. And so again, I'm gonna raise the issue.
I like that. You sound like you about to buck up a little bit. You're like, yeah, I'm gonna raise the issue. I'm gonna raise. I like that. And I think that is an important thing. Is we have to be willing to be the ones to keep it up, to keep up, to continue raising the issue. And I think even I would add, going back to your initial advice right before this comment, was making sure it's part of the policies and procedures, right? And
Right?
getting it in writing, like having people not just,
Yeah.
not just have a panel on colorism for Black History Month, but now like let's actually put this into a written procedure. Right. Let's put this
Yes.
into our written code of ethics or whatever. And, having it be on agenda items in future diversity, equity, and inclusion meetings.
You're absolutely right. And having a process in terms of if someone feels like they're being, the victim of colorism, what is the process, right? What is the process to
Mm.
make that complaint, right? To file that complaint, and how is it handled, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So great points about making values come off the paper. And Jandel Crutchfield says, do you find that folks rally behind lighter skinned Black employees who speak up about racism more than they do for darker skinned employees that speak up?
That's a good question. I think there is somewhat a level of comfort with light skinned folks speaking up, because sometimes I think when dark skinned people raise the issue, there's gaslighting that goes on, or folks are like, well, you're speaking out of emotion, right? That's been emotionally driven in terms of what you're saying. Sometimes it's perceived that that lighter skinned person who's bringing it up, that they're being more objective. I also have
Mhm.
found that when the issue comes up about colorism, people often can bring up the example of, this light skinned person that I know was not seen black enough and was mistreated, and
Mhm.
can't or won't allow themselves to think about, the colorism in terms of what we're talking about, the systematic, discrimination and prejudice against dark skinned people. So even
Mm.
just the level of comfort, because sometimes, again, I'm going into spaces, sometimes, black only spaces, right? And there's always a person who feels comfortable bringing it up that I was never, they were never perceived as being black enough. And then if I say something, oh goodness, I never, sometimes crickets.
Yep.
I'd be the only voice.
Mhm. I'm so glad, Aliette, that you mentioned that. Okay, is the ease and the seeming just acceptance and comfort that people of all races have, including Black people have, when a light skinned and or biracial person talks about their experiences of being told or being made to feel like they weren't quote unquote Black enough,
Mhm.
and how that seems to garner so much sympathy from
Yeah.
everyone. I remember being on a panel about colorism, and for some reason, that narrative dominated the panel that was supposed to be about colorism, right? But
Mhm.
I just have to say this, like oftentimes, especially if we're talking about biracial people or mixed race people, a lot of times being told you're not quote unquote Black enough is not really about being light skinned. It's more of a cultural thing. And so even
Mhm.
the difference between colorism and cultural differences is important, because you can be dark skinned and be told you're not Black enough based on how you talk,
Right.
based on the
Right.
music you listen to, based on the kinds of hobbies that you have, right? And so a lot of
Mhm.
times that label of like, oh, you ain't really Black, or that notion of not being Black enough has nothing to do with color. It's not actually about the fact that they're light skinned. It might be the fact that they have a white parent, and people are
Right.
saying that.
Mhm.
And so even though those things might be related to colorism, I don't like when they're conflated, when they're
Mhm.
made to be seen or centered as the crux of what colorism is, because it's not. But I also think too, like going back to just the a level of sympathy and compassion, and the question, like people will rush to the defense of lighter
Yes.
skinned people much faster. They
Mhm.
will try to make lighter skinned people feel good and feel safe, whereas if you're darker
Mhm.
skin, oftentimes it's like, oh well, you can handle it on your own, or she'll get through it. They might say they're rooting you on, but they're not going to actually like come to defend you. And so a lot of times we find ourselves fighting these battles and looking around, and there's no like tangible concrete support, even if people say they support us with their words.
And I will say this, and I have been in discussions that folks are having sympathy and compassion for a lighter skinned person or mixed race person. And then somehow it comes up in conversations that a dark skinned woman or girl is the one who victimized them or was aggressive towards them. And then is pointing at dark skinned women and girls as if we are the ones that are perpetuating colorism, and yeah, and we're the ones causing harm.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think there's an important discussion about the systemic aspect of colorism, and I think people ignore that or try to suppress the systemic conversations about colorism so that
Yes.
they can make those kinds of arguments, so that they can make those kinds of claims, right? And we know that some of the same people who can explain why there's no such thing as reverse racism for
Right.
some reason seem to think that there's a thing as reverse colorism. And so I think just in our culture and our society, people trivialize colorism and try to sweep it under the rug, try to make it seem as a frivolous thing relative to racism. But I think we need to see it as on par with racism,
Mhm.
right? Like, okay, so you don't
Agree.
think it's more important than racism, but at least concede that it's on par with racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism and things like that. Um, all right. I like where the questions took our conversation. I think that was a very fruitful thing. Let's see. Janelle Crutchfield says, I've been on a panel like that too, and I called Dr. Webb to help figure out how to push back. Yeah,
Mm,
talking about, people focusing on being mistreated as light-skinned people, right? Um,
right.
and Aaron says gaslighting like no other. All right, folks, I really appreciate the live engagement this week too. If you're interested in, keeping in touch with Olliette, you can follow her here on LinkedIn, Olliette Murry-Drobot. I'll put her name back on the screen shortly. But she is, again, also a consultant, has her own consulting firm for businesses and organizations. So you can email her at the address on the screen. And let me put your name back up there as well if people want to connect with you on LinkedIn. And I will be back next week with a few more guests to talk about interventions and preventions in the workplace. And then one more week after that, we'll be wrapping up this mini series on colorism in the workplace. So I hope you all can join us for that as well. And I'll leave with this last slide. Great convo, Olliette. And so I'm so thankful that you made time for us today. Let us know if there's anything else you'd like the audience to know in terms of contacting you or before I, end the live for this evening.
Yeah, so folks can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. So yeah, Olliette Murry-Drobot. I would love to hear from folks.
All right. Woohoo. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. And don't let this be the last time you talk about colorism. Bye.